So today I have the pleasure to introduce Professor Johannes Fahrenfort from the University of Amsterdam in the Netherlands. Johannes did his doctorate on the topic of conscious and unconscious vision under the supervision of Victor Lamme, and has received his PhD in cognitive neuroscience from the University of Amsterdam in 2007, and then proceeded to fill postdoc positions with Richard Ridderinghoff and Victor Lamme, among others. He worked for 2 years as assistant professor at the University of Utrecht, before in 2014 he took his current office as an assistant professor back at the University of Amsterdam, where he founded the Conscious Brain Lab together with Simon van Gaal. Besides his research focus in consciousness and decision-making, where he's definitely made his mark already, he has a strong interest in advanced neuroscientific methods, which has condensed not only in several papers about multivariate analysis of EEG and MEG data, but also in coding the lion's share of the Amsterdam Decoding and Modeling Toolbox, or ADAM for short, which is a super cool, intuitive, and easy to handle way to get into MEG decoding in MATLAB. And in line with this latter interest, today's talk will be mostly about the pitfalls of decoding from MEG data, such as the effects of high-pass filtering. So, Johannes, we are happy to have you here as a speaker now.
Great, thanks a lot for this introduction. Super nice. Thanks for having me. One quick note: I'm actually not at the University of Amsterdam, but I'm at the Vrije University in Amsterdam. But we go back and forth quite a bit between the University of Amsterdam and the Vrije University because of my collaborations with Simon van Gaal. That's just a slight correction, but all the rest was correct. Thanks for having me. What I would like to talk today about are some pitfalls that I came across over the years in decoding of EEG data, and they're just sort of illustrations of things to look out for, and it's not a complete list by any means. It's just some things that were sort of practical things that I came across. So hopefully that will be useful for you to take with you as you do your own decoding analyses and so forth. The things that I'd like to talk about. So what I'll do is I'll highlight 3 things basically that I'll talk about. So I'll briefly talk about the ADAM toolbox that I developed already now some 6 years ago, and I'll give a very brief background of it. I won't talk super long about it, but I do want to highlight something that I think is important for people to know when they go into decoding. Especially when you don't come from a sort of decoding lab, or you just go from EEG ERPs and you move to decoding, things to be aware of. And then I'll talk about the influence of high-pass filtering, or the potential influence of high-pass filtering confounds in decoding. And then finally, I'll talk a bit about actually consciousness also, which is my original sort of interest. So I'll talk about some pitfalls in consciousness research in relation to post-hoc sorting. I'll go into detail what I mean by that. So first, the ADAM toolbox. I hear that some of you use it, which is super nice to hear. So I originally wrote this to make it easier for students that I was supervising to sort of do analyses in MATLAB. Nowadays, many people also move to Python, which is great, but I'm a bit of a dinosaur, so I'm still in the MATLAB ecosystem, and many people are actually. And there's not much of decoding, EEG decoding in MATLAB. There are, of course, toolboxes that allow you to do that, but this toolbox was really aimed to make it simple. So to make it simple for people who don't have a lot of programming experience, to sort of go from doing old school, old-fashioned ERPs and try their own decoding analyses. With that, I also want to sort of make a note of caution that although this toolbox is easy to use and it allows you to do quite a few things, such as compute, of course, decoding or perform decoding analyses and plot the results of that and compare them to ERPs, for example. And it has quite a few options. So you can also do, for example, when you just input the raw data, you can do time frequency analysis and then decoding on the time frequency data within the toolbox. But I do want to make a note of caution that I wrote this thing myself and already quite some time ago. And there's not really a development team behind it. And there's not many people or actually nobody except for me actively working on it. So that means that support for this toolbox is limited. And that if you want to move to, things that require more support or long-term support, then it might be smart to look elsewhere. But if you're like really used to using MATLAB and you really want to sort of get a first dip your toes in the water for the first time, then this can be a nice toolbox to use. So that's just a bit of a caution. To get everybody on the same page, I just quickly want to go over what EEG decoding results look like. I think most of you will know this, but these are just some images that I stole from a sort of nice intro paper from 2017 by Tel Grootswagers and colleagues. So the idea is that you have data with different features. So in this sort of simplified example, you have just two features, but that's just for plotting reasons. So one electrode on the x-axis and one electrode on the y-axis. And you have a minimum of two conditions, you might say. These are in decoding called classes or in machine learning that you want to sort of tell apart. You want to know whether there's different information with respect to these conditions or classes in the brain. And then what happens is that you have this multidimensional space, and in this example, it's just two-dimensional, but you have to imagine it as if you have, for example, in a most standard EEG systems have like 64 electrodes. So it's a 64-dimensional space, you might say. And whenever you measure something, you, of course, in EEG also have time. I'll get to that in a second, but let's assume that we just have one time point in this multidimensional space. Then what you do is you try to separate out the measurements that you collected for these two conditions or classes, and that separating out happens through a training procedure in which the algorithm, and there can be various algorithms. My toolbox typically uses LDA, but can also be something else like support vector machine or something else, tries to separate out these classes by drawing what's called a decision boundary. And the decision boundary is basically just a sort of a line or a plane, you might say, through this multidimensional space that sort of tells apart which of these measurements belongs to one class and which belongs to the other class. And it does that by just telling it, hey, all these measurements are from this class and all these measurements are from the other class. And then it draws, the algorithm draws, I'm not going to go into how it does that, but it draws sort of in this multidimensional space, this decision boundary. And this training can happen in different ways. So an important part of this training is that you need to have some independent data set to train on, and I'll talk a bit more about that on the next slide. So there's typically two ways in which this independence is achieved. So having the training data be completely separate, either through what's called k-folding or through having a completely separate data set. And then once you have this training, you can sort of unleash it, this trained classifier, you can unleash it on testing data. And the testing data then tries to identify for measurements that it hasn't seen before, hey, does this measurement belong to one stimulus class or does it belong to a different stimulus class? So in this example, the decision boundary is here. And for these two, it correctly identifies them as belonging to one class, and for this to the other class, but here it makes an error, a mistake. So the classifier is not going to be 100% accurate. Often it's going to make small mistakes. The testing of the data set is to establish how accurate the classifier can be. And when it makes an assessment about how whether the stimulus belongs to one or another class, it also determines how far that stimulus is from the decision boundary, and that distance can be seen as sort of the confidence that the classifier has. And these confidences can also be used I'm also not going to go into that in this presentation, but they can be used, for example, by correlating them to reaction times or to other measures that you take of a participant. But that's a potential use of these confidences. But that particular aspect is not typically used. Typically, people just look at the accuracy of the classifier over time. So you have an x-axis, and you have the stimulus unfolding over time. So here you see basically for a whole bunch of different samples over time where this trained test procedure has taken place. And then on the y-axis, it plots the classification accuracy. And this sometimes is also referred to as diagonal decoding to tell it apart from temporal generalization. So in temporal generalization, basically what you do is you combine all the trained data points with all the test data points to see whether training on a data pattern on one point in time generalizes to testing it at another point in time. And when it generalizes to another point in time, that means that the representation doesn't change, or at least is similar to the other representation. So those are sort of the outputs that you get, either diagonal decoding or some temporal generalization. By the way, I'm gonna assume, I'm not gonna explain more about this. I'm gonna assume that this is sort of known to everybody. If you feel that the majority of the room is uncomfortable or doesn't understand this, then please let me know and interrupt me. Then I can devote more words to it. But otherwise, I'm just gonna continue, if that's okay. Yeah, in general, also, like if I think like we set to answer questions at the end, which is also fine, but I'm also fine with interrupting me halfway if something is just unclear. You can just let me know, and then I'll respond to that. And then another thing you get is sort of a topographic map. You also get that from raw ERPs, right? You can plot a topographic map, and you can use the toolbox also to plot that. But it's done by taking the weights, because these the training of the classifier basically results in weights, and those weights tell you something about how each of the electrodes contribute to separating the classes. You can also plot those weights directly, but they cannot really be interpreted as neural data, but you can take the product of the weights and the covariance matrix of the data, and then you get back basically the same thing that you would get when you would plot the difference between the conditions as a topographic distribution. So just a univariate analysis that you would do. But this at least gives a nice sort of control once you do an analysis like that, that your data were analyzed in a meaningful way, and that the classifier extracted meaningful information. So that's basically just a very quick thing to get everybody on the same page. And then, as I said, it's important to keep your training and test data independent to prevent the influence of overfitting. So what's overfitting? So you have this drawing of this decision boundary between the two classes in this multivariate space, and that can be a linear sort of line or plane. It can also be a nonlinear plane that looks like this. But importantly, what can be the case is if you use if you train the classifier, it can be that the classifier learns things about your data that are idiosyncratic to your sample, that are not sort of generalizable to the to all the measurements in the world that you could take of these data. And then you get something that's called overfitting. So this is just a Wikipedia illustration from what overfitting is. It's basically the idea that the classifier tries to draw this decision boundary, but when it tries to draw that decision boundary as accurately as it can using the data at hand, it can learn things about the data that are idiosyncratic. And that's what you see here. You get this wobbled line that is perfectly able to tease apart stimuli from one class and from another class in this particular data set. But that includes sort of noise that's in the data. So things that end up on the other part of the decision boundary, just because there is some measurement noise, and that doesn't actually reflect the real boundary between the two classes. And then if you would train and test on the same data, basically you would capitalize on this noise, and you would get a very high classification accuracy, because it's learning something idiosyncratic in your data, and it's not really generalizing about what's real between the difference between these two classes and in the real world. So you want to prevent that, and the way of preventing that is by testing your trained classifier not on the data on which it was trained, but on an independent data set or independent data on which the classifier wasn't trained, so that any of these idiosyncrasies don't result in improved classification accuracy. So that's what happens also in this toolbox, that there's two ways basically of keeping your training data and your testing data separate. And one of the two ways, as I said, is k-fold cross-validation. And what happens in k-fold cross-validation is basically that you partition up your data set, and these lines here are 5 partitions basically. So this is a 5-fold cross-validation, and then for every fold basically in this cross-validation scheme, you train on 90% of your data and you test on 10% of your data. And by doing that, you're keeping your training and your test data separate, so that you prevent the influence of any overfitting that might have occurred to present itself in your classification accuracies. So that your classification accuracy is really a reflection of really how well you can tell apart those two classes without the influence of overfitting. So this is one way, k-fold cross-validation. And another way is keeping your training and your testing data separate by just having a separate data set for training. So collecting, for example, when you have an EEG experiment, collecting one part of your data just for training your classifier, and another part of your experiment is your really experimental design, where you have maybe manipulations occurring and so forth. So a general advice that I would like to give in this talk, that's basically my first advice, is to be very careful with using k-fold cross-validation schemes, and especially when you have a bit of a complex design, because there you very quickly get into trouble, and I'll explain to you why that is. So one reason why that is, or maybe the most important reason why that is that the effect of increasing or decreasing your trial count is different depending on whether it pertains to your training data or whether it pertains to your test data. So if you increase the number of trials in your trained data, basically what happens is that the classifier becomes better at drawing the decision boundary, because it has more data to train on. And that then increases, when you test that classifier on your test data, increases your classification accuracy. But that also means that if you have 2 data sets with unequal trial counts, that the decoding is going to be better in the data set with more trials in your trained data compared to the other one. And if you have some cross-validation scheme, and you, for example, have 2 conditions where you have some factorial design, I'll give an example on the next slide, and you do some cross-validation scheme within that design, and there's unequal trial counts there, then it becomes impossible to meaningfully compare your classification accuracies. If there's differences in trial counts in your test set, that's not so problematic, because if there's differences in test set, basically the only thing that happens is that the precision of your classifier accuracy becomes higher. When you have more trials to test your classifier on, it's just that the acuity, you might say, the precision on the y-axis becomes higher, but on average, the classification accuracy that comes out shouldn't change when you increase the number of test trials. That only happens when you increase the number of trials in your train set. Yeah, I try to sort of depict that here, where you see a larger error bar when there's 250 trials in your test set, and a smaller error bar when there's 500 trials in your test set. So this is all just not real data, of course, just as an example. But the precision only, you only get better precision, but you don't get actually changes in the estimate of the classification accuracy itself. So why is then k-folding problematic? K-folding is problematic in factorial designs, for example, when you have unequal trial counts. So often it would be nice if all factorial designs, and many people use factorial designs, of course, would have exactly identical trial counts, but often they don't. Often not by design, because, for example, you have queues, and those queues can have more validity or less validity, and then you automatically have, at least when you queue as a function of the number of trials, you can have more validly queues and fewer validly queued trials, and then you get different trial counts because of that. But there can be many other reasons why your design is unbalanced as well. And then if you use a k-fold trained test scheme, then you immediately run into trouble, because then you can have unequal trial counts or unequal stimuli from one class or from another class going into your training data. And every time that I have, almost every time that I have decided beforehand, okay, well, in this design is so simple, it really doesn't matter. I might as well just do away with the train set, and I'll just go for a cross-validation scheme. Almost always I've regretted it afterwards and thought, well, it would have been better if I would have had just a separate training data set. So in my experience, at least in the type of designs that I use, and especially with factorial designs, it is better to have a separate train set, and then you can just apply your train, your classifier to any cells or combination of cells that you want to, and it becomes much easier to compare them. So even when your design seems balanced at first glance, it is often still better to have a separate train set. So here's an example of that. Let's say you have 35% trials that were queued and 30% of the trials that were not queued, or in total 70% of the trials were queued and 30% were not queued. Then you already have a difference in trial counts. And then if you would, for example, look at decoding accuracy within any given condition, so either the condition where the stimuli were queued with a house or with a neutral queue, then it already becomes impossible to properly compare them without throwing out trials if you use k-folding. So it's just a practical piece of advice. So yeah, that's my first, I guess, advice, that that it's better to go for separate train sets whenever you can, and especially in the cases that I highlighted. And the tool, so that's basically the second option, you might say, the toolbox that just makes things a lot easier. The second thing that I would like to talk about is the influence of high-pass filtering. So this is a project that was executed by Johan van Driel together with Chris Olivers, and at the time we were working on working memory. Or I was working on working memory together with Joram, we had an experiment in which had a pretty simple design. Participants had to remember something, so they got a cue to remember either a face, a house, or a letter, and then there was a retention interval that was 3 seconds here, and then there was a test interval where they had to search for the item that they had in memory, and then we were looking at the degree to which we could apply category decoding to the memory item in between. And actually, it was a more complex experiment than that. It had different interval durations. That's not really relevant for now. But what is relevant is that we got into a problem when we started doing decoding in this experiment, and that's that we started seeing effects that we not only couldn't explain, but that had to be wrong. We just would see decoding at points in time where there could not have been decoding. So like you see here, the baseline, or just weird effects. And of course, the trials were very long. Some of them were 3 seconds, but we also had trials of 6 seconds. And we got worried, of course. So we were like, okay, something is wrong. This is just an illustration that comes from the paper that followed, that came out of this. But I don't have an actual illustration of the things that we initially came across. But that's just to give you an idea that we started identifying these sort of anomalies, you might say. And then we started to investigate. So we were like, okay, what could be wrong here? And the first thing that came to mind is that there might be something wrong with the filtering, or that not wrong with the filtering, but that the filtering had an effect on our analyses and that this caused these anomalies. So to explain that, I just quickly want to go over what happens in filtering. In filtering, this is an example of a low-pass filter. What happens, of course, is that you have some sort of ERP with, in this example, some sort of high-frequency noise, and you want to get rid of it through filtering. And what happens is that you apply, at least under the hood, when you apply a filter, what happens is that typically a fast Fourier transform is executed, and that means that the signal basically is transformed into, from the time domain, because this is time domain with time on the x-axis, amplitude on the y-axis, is transformed into into the frequency domain, and that means that there's frequency now on the x-axis, and that there is power, you might say, on the y-axis. So how much each of those frequencies are present in the signal. And then what happens in filtering is basically that you use this frequency domain representation and you multiply it with a filter. And a filter basically says, okay, I'm going to get rid of part of those frequencies by specifying which parts of the frequency domain I'm going to leave intact and which ones I'm going to attenuate. So basically taking this this frequency domain representation and multiplying it with a filter like this, you can basically remove parts of the frequency representation. And that's what you see here. So there's a bit of a 60 hertz frequency signal in here, and by multiplying it with this filter, this 60 hertz frequency disappears, right? So you multiply this by this, and because this is very low, so it attenuates it, so this part disappears, and then you can apply an inverse Fourier transform and go back to the original signal, and then you have your filtered signal. So that's just a bit of understanding of how filtering works, a bit of textbook explanation. And this was an explanation of a low-pass filter. What we were more worried about was high-pass filters, right? For low-pass filters, they also can be problematic, and it's quite well highlighted in the literature, all the problems that exist in ERP research as well, both for low-pass filters and for high-pass filters. But for this example, for example, you can see that it's relatively easy to draw the line between what's signal and what's noise, right? So there's this high frequency 60 hertz peak that you can sort of separate out from these low frequencies, and it becomes quite plausible that that's noise, and you can take it out. But in high-pass filtering, that's a bit more problematic. It can also be problematic for low pass, but even more in high pass. So in high pass filtering, what you do is you remove the low frequencies. And if you look at this frequency domain representation, you see that there is low frequencies here that sit basically adjacent to, or basically are almost integrated with the actual ERP. So this is the entire low frequency representation. And if you want to take out the very low frequencies, which are mostly often drifts that occur in the signal that you want to get rid of, then it becomes much harder to say where exactly do I draw the line between what is drift and what is signal, right? So where to draw that line is more problematic. Yeah, you can see that whatever high-pass filter you apply. So here's an example of an ERP where a number of different frequencies, high-pass filter frequencies have been applied. You see that all of them, well, they do two things. One of the things that they do is you see that the black signal that you see here is a simulated ERP. So this is just for illustration purposes. That has quite a bit of drift to it. So that's why it starts so low. So there's sort of this drift here. You see that the high pass filter removes that drift in the sense that the entire ERP sort of gets pushed back to where it should be, which is around the baseline. But what you also see is that the original simulated ERP would be exactly going exactly along this baseline height, and then you would have an ERP and so forth. You see that all the filtered signals that you have regardless of whether it's a 0.05 high-pass filter or a much more liberal 0.5 high-pass filter, that they all result in these sort of distortions also in the baseline window. Right, and that's the fact that this resulted that results from the fact that there's an interaction between the actual signal and the height of the high pass filter. So you get these sort of distortions and temporal displacement in this example in the baseline. So back to our working memory experiment, I just tried to give all this sort of lecture textbook background to sort of explain what the effect of filters is. But we wanted to sort of investigate, okay, what do these filters do in a decoding context where the trials are quite long. So we have quite long trials here over 3 seconds. So what we did is we just took the data that we had from one of our conditions, where we just had this simple sort of setup that I already explained. And we looked at the decoding, and in this case, for illustration, because it becomes much more apparent these effects in temporal generalization, we looked at temporal generalization. So this is basically decoding of this trial setup in a temporal generalization matrix. So color, of course, is the decoding accuracy of the classifier. The x-axis is testing time and the y-axis is training time. And the 1 and the 2 that you see here are the Q and the search array. And in the middle here, what you have is the retention interval between 1 and 2. And then you also have 3 and 4, and those are basically the degree to which the Q generalizes to the search interval, and the degree to which the search interval generalizes to the Q. So the degree to which these two have similar representations. And what you see in this plot is indeed that nicely the information that's presented at Q time and the information that's presented during the search array is similar, right? So people are looking for a face, they identify the face in the search display. So you see that those two generalize to each other. And you see that there's some nice decoding accuracy here and some nice decoding accuracy here at the time of the Q and at the time of the search display. However, these are just the raw data. So this is unfiltered data. And then the next thing that we wanted to look at is, okay, what does this look like when you now apply different filters to these data and then look at the same thing. And then what you see that there is actually all these anomalies appearing in the temporal generalization matrix that are a direct result basically of these filtering operations. So you see that here already in the baseline, you get below chance decoding. Here you get below chance decoding here as well. You get some strange peaks here when you're using a 0.05 hertz high pass filter. When you use a 0.1 high pass filter, the situation becomes even worse. So now you get lots of decoding in the baseline window, and also this sort of strange pattern of improved and decreased below chance decoding. Blue is below chance decoding. As a result of this filter, and in the 0.5 high pass filter, yeah, it just becomes way more focal, but you still have all these weird anomalies. Yeah, so this immediately indicated that this filtering operation really affected the decoding in quite drastic ways, especially again for these long trials, right? Because these trials are long, you're doing high pass filtering, so they're likely to interact also with the filter, because the filter filters out very slow trends, and my trials are also long and slow, so you're quick to get such interactions. So then we sort of try to think about, hey, can we do things to get rid of that? So we the first thing we looked at was the detrending. So a paper came out around the same time that was called Robust Detrending, referencing outlier detection and in-painting for multi-channel data. And it basically applied the detrending procedures to remove drifts from the signal rather than filtering. So what is detrending? Detrending is basically fitting some sort of line to your data and then subtracting out that line. So in the top panel here, you see a first order polynomial. That's basically just a straight line being fitted to the data here. And then when you subtract that out, you're basically removing the trend in your data. That's a very basic step that every EEG analysis package from the old days would offer you to detrend your data using a straight line, basically. But you can also use a more complex line, right? So you can use a 30th order or other order polynomial where you give more degrees of freedom to fit your data to the line. And then you can basically subtract out that fit. And that way you can remove drifts in your signal. So that's what you see going from the top to the bottom. That here it's a first order polynomial, it's a straight line. Here it's a more complex polynomial, and then as you go down, you basically remove more drifts from your signal. And it's good to point to the y-axis here, so you see that a lot of variation disappears. Maybe at first glance it looks like not much is happening, but actually all the large drifts disappear from the signal as a result of this detrending operation. But again, you could ask, okay, where do you draw the line between signal and drift noise, right? Because you would think that this sort of detrending operation would be sensitive to the same problem, that maybe the polynomial starts fitting to your actual ERPs. So that's why we were enthusiastic about this robust detrending technique, because the robust detrending technique that they published about was basically an extension of regular detrending, in the sense that it would automatically detect glitches in your data. So let's say that there's some sort of jump in your data and you fit a polynomial to that. Then this detrending algorithm automatically identifies this glitch and interpolates across that glitch. So basically here you would see, this is sort of the thing that would happen normally, and then you fit some sort of line to it, and then this is the detrended data in the top panel. In the middle panel, you see that some sort of glitch is happening, and you would get then, if you would apply some sort of detrending operation to that, including the glitch, you would get a huge artifact in there. But if you interpolate that glitch, as they do in the bottom panel, then basically you have no problem. You still have the glitch in the result, of course, but it doesn't affect your detrending operation itself. So our hope initially was, okay, maybe this will also sort of identify the ERPs as glitches or something, and then get rid of any problems. But in fact, that didn't happen. So if you look at you apply detrending to remove sort of slow drift from your signal, you still get all these artifacts that we would also get in high pass filtering. But then we thought, well, but maybe we can just tell the algorithm where our ERPs are, and that was our next step. So basically saying, hey, those ERPs are not glitches, they're not masked out automatically, but maybe we can mask them out ourselves, and by masking them out, we sort of introduced an extension of this robust detrending method that we call trial masked robust detrending, and that basically just involves telling the algorithm, hey, this part of the signal that you're seeing is actually ERP, because I know when in the time series I would present information to the participants, and I could just say, okay, here is basically a masked portion of the data, and I'm going to tell the algorithm to skip that part and to interpolate across that part, and then I could basically do detrending without getting these interactions with the signal. So that's what we did with trial masked robust detrending. And then if you do the same thing, we saw that very nicely all the artifacts that we saw before disappeared, so that we could still remove those drifts, but you wouldn't see all those hefty artifacts that you would get here and here and here and here in the high pass filtering and robust detrending, regular robust detrending operations. Okay, so this is all very nice, but maybe some of you are wondering, okay, if this is the case, if you have this high pass filtering problems that you get, then why don't we see that more often? Why don't you just see all those confounds appear in decoding data? And the reason for that is that I didn't tell you that in all the examples I gave so far, we didn't actually apply baseline correction. So here we see an example of these confounds that appear in a 0.05 hertz high pass filter situation. But if we take these exact same data and then we apply a baseline correction to those data, then actually all those confounds seem to disappear. But the problem here, or not the problem, is the thing that I want to highlight here is that that is a seeming disappearance, right? What happens when you do that, when you baseline correct after high pass filtering, you seem to resolve the artifact, but you're actually not resolving it. What actually happens when you do baseline correction is that you're subtracting out the average activity in every channel for your data from the entire trial. And by doing that, you're basically transporting back the confound that was introduced here and transporting it back to the rest of your trial. But that's not really resolving the problem. It's just merely displacing it back to where it might need to be or should be, but you're not sure, right? You don't know for certain whether you're actually doing the right thing there by just subtracting it out to the baseline correction. So you seem to maybe resolve the artifact, or at least you won't notice the artifact. I guess that's the point that I want to make here, that it would be very easy to not notice this problem that I highlighted in the previous slides, just because this baseline correction hides it. And the same is true for robust detrending. So if you first do this robust detrending, where you would normally still see these artifacts without baseline correction, after baseline correction, they seem to be gone. At least you don't see them anymore, but they could still be there. And the fact that they are still there is also highlighted when you look at all these high pass filter settings. So in the 0.05 hertz high pass filter setting, nothing strange seems to happen. In the 0.01 hertz high pass filter, something starts to occur here. And it's important to notice here that this baseline window here, or this pre-stimulus period here, is very long. It's 1.5 seconds. And the baseline window is only 300 milliseconds. So it seems, if you would plot a narrower portion of this temporal generalization matrix, nothing would seem to be going wrong. But actually, all this stuff that is introduced here are confounds that come directly from applying a baseline correction here to a confound that was introduced by the filter. Then also causes these above chance decoding accuracies. And that's especially relevant for people looking into working memory, right? Because in working memory, you want to be sure that whatever you're decoding in EEG during the retention interval is an actual reflection of working memory. And that is not some confound that's double confound that's introduced by first filtering and then doing some baseline subtraction. The situation becomes even worse here in the 0.5 hertz high pass filter, where you see very strong confounds here all over the place. And again, these wouldn't maybe strike anybody as odd if you would just plot only the part of the graph on which the actual baseline correction was performed. Again, if you would do all this, stuff with robust detrending I'm moving ahead of myself. You don't see any of these effects when you do regular robust detrending with baseline correction either. So if you do regular robust detrending with baseline correction, actually all those confounds that you see here don't seem to appear, but they're just sort of hidden, I would say, under the surface. So that's my second point of advice, that a best practice is actually to, especially when you have long trials, to either just do your decoding on baseline data, but raw baseline data without high pass filtering, or if you do high pass filtering, to use a very conservative high pass filter. Or what you could also do is, of course, use our extended method, the trial master robust detrending method. But yeah, my experience is that it takes a bit of time and it can be tricky depending on how messy your data are. That you also have to specify, of course, which windows contain your trials. So there's quite a few intricacies involved in doing that that I won't go into now. But it might just be better to, especially if you have relatively clean data, and you are interested in precise timing to just not do any high pass filtering or low pass filtering at all, and just do your data analysis on just baseline raw data. So that's my my second point. I see that it's already 4:45, and I actually have a third point, but it takes up quite a few, quite a lot of slides that I have left to make my third point, because it's a bit of a complicated thing that I have to explain. So I guess I want to have a quick discussion with what I should do. I think that if I continue, there won't be any time left for questions. I hope that I can even finish in time, or we could say, okay, let's skip the last part and go into questions.
I think just go on, and then we have maybe a bit of time still left, and can do a bit longer if it's fine with you. Yeah.
Okay, it's fine by me. I do warn you that I hope that I can finish before 5, but I might run over a little bit. Is that a problem?
Oh, no, not at all. Yeah, just go for it.
Okay, I'll go for it. Okay, so then the last thing that I want to talk about is how decoding can leverage confounds. So here is coming back to my sort of original interest, which is consciousness. About 10 years ago, there was a whole bunch of papers that in the decade that ensued came out regarding unconscious working memory. Now, working memory, of course, involves maintaining something in memory, actively maintaining something in memory. So it was quite a sort of surprising finding that people would be able to maintain information that they were not conscious of and actually never consciously perceived, at least according to these experiments. And what I want to highlight here is the notion that I think that these results, and they haven't been published yet, but I'm in the process of preparing the publication, that these results are actually a more general confound that results from all approaches in consciousness science, but could also be extended to other situations in which people apply post-hoc sorting to trials. So post-hoc sorting is basically the idea that you're not creating conditions based on the experimental manipulations that people do, but that you're partitioning your conditions based on the responses that your participants give. So to give an example here in the context of consciousness, there are sort of two types of measures that people use in consciousness research, or maybe more, but the most prominent ones are objective and subjective measures of awareness. In objective measures, basically you do standard signal detection theory. You just establish how sensitive a person is to detecting a stimulus that's masked or blinked by the attentional blink or something else. And then if people have a D prime of 0 or close to 0, then they are thought to be unconscious of the stimulus. But there's also a whole set of experiments, including the ones that I highlighted on the previous page, that use a technique that's called subjective measures. And in subjective measures, what people do is they basically have people indicate, do I see the stimulus or do I not see the stimulus? And then they partition the conscious and the unconscious condition just by taking all the stimulus that the participant indicated to have seen as the conscious ones, and all the ones that they did not see, or at least indicated to not see, as the unconscious condition. And this is called post-hoc sorting, or it is an example of post-hoc sorting, where you, after the experiment is over, partition your experimental trials into conditions. So what I want to talk about in this part is the effect of criterion shifts on, in this case, the neural correlates of unconscious or conscious processing under post-hoc sorting. And to explain what I mean by that, I want to give a small example, a little thought experiment. So the thought experiment goes like this. So please imagine that you're being put in a room and the room is very dim. There is still some light on, but I'll turn that off in a second. And after that, I'm going to ask you to detect a light. And it's a very faint light, and you're asked to just press a button whenever you see the light appear. So I turn the lights off, and then I start, and then I don't know whether you are able to see this, but every once in a while, something appears very dimly on the screen. If you didn't see it, maybe it's because of the beamer. I don't know whether you saw little flashes on the screen.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So that's visible then. So that's the idea that you try to detect this very dim light. So I have you do this for a little while, and then I turn the lights back on, and I say, okay, we're now going to redo this little experiment, but this time I'm going to have you detect every light, and every time you miss a light, and you didn't press the button, even though I presented it, I'm going to take 100 euros out of your pocket. So we repeat the experiment, turn the light off, and again, we'll have very faint lights, and we'll see what the participant does. And I think you can all imagine what will happen. The participant will become very trigger happy, as it's called. Will be very eager to detect or press a button whenever the faintest thing comes into view, because that person doesn't want to lose any money, right? And 100 euros is quite a bit. So you become very trigger happy and press the button all the time. So this is called a criterion shift. You basically change your criterion to detect a stimulus or not. The question is, do you then also consciously experience more lights in the second case? And that, surprisingly enough, is sort of, as of now, still somewhat of an empirical question. But the assumption would be, in the subjective measures approach to consciousness, is that actually when you press, you see a thing, you become conscious of it, and when you press, you don't see it, then you don't become conscious of it. So in that world of subjective measures, those criterion shifts would also involve shifts in conscious experience. I think you can debate about that quite a bit. And actually, we had most people actually don't believe that this involves a shift in conscious experience, and even consciousness researchers mostly don't. So there's a big consciousness conference where we asked this question to many respondents, and those are all the people doing consciousness research. And actually 65% of those people don't believe, and this conference also includes philosophers and all sorts of other maybe somewhat esoteric people that are not involved in psychology or cognitive neuroscience research. But even including those people, 65% of people don't believe that this criterion shift results in a change in conscious experience. But in the subjective measures framework, the assumption is that those responses reflect your conscious experience. So that if you respond seen, you see it. If you respond unseen, you don't see it. And then also a prediction of the subjective measures framework would be that if the stimulus is identical in terms of physical stimulation, as in the example that I just gave, then the neural correlate of those things, seen and unseen, regardless of your criterion, should be the same. So if I apply sort of a decoding algorithm to those stimuli, then within the subjective measures framework, if the decoding reflects your conscious experience, you should get equal decoding, regardless of whether people use a liberal criterion, so they are very trigger happy, or a conservative criterion where they don't press the button very quickly. That's the subjective measures framework. Of course, we also have the signal detection theory framework, and the signal detection theory framework says, well, there's just a relationship between the response and the stimulus in such a way that you have 4 possible combinations. You detect it when it's there, you don't detect it when it's there, you detect it when it's not there, or you don't detect it when it's not there. Hits, misses, false alarms, correct rejections. And the relative ratio of combinations shifts depending on your criterion, right? So in an SDT framework, basically you can, your criterion shifts. So here you see a classical depiction of a signal detection theory distributions. And in the conservative case, you basically shift your criterion in that direction. And you're more likely to press unseen, and in a liberal condition, you're more likely to press seen. Now, I want to highlight here the implication of the signal detection theory framework if you apply post-hoc sorting to the responses that participants give, and what you would predict would happen if you start to apply decoding to those conditions. And what is that implication? That implication is that if you move your criterion here to in the conservative case, to the right, then, and this is critical, both for the unseen condition and for the seen condition, the average signal so the average signal, that's basically when you would average across all these trials here in this condition, is higher in the conservative condition and is higher for both for the seen and for the unseen case. So that's illustrated by the fact that this line moves here to the right. This dot here is sort of the average of the condition, the average signal strength, and it moves to the right. So that means that the average signal strength becomes higher, both for the unseen and for the seen condition. And the implication of that is that if you apply decoding, a decoding algorithm on those data, that's what you see on the right here, then you would predict that both for the unseen and for the seen case, you get higher decoding accuracy under the conservative condition than under the liberal condition. So this one is higher than this one, and this one is higher than this one. This is a bit of a complicated thing to explain, so I hope this is clear to everybody. If not, let me know, then I can just devote a couple more words to it. If it's clear, I'm gonna continue. So basically these two frameworks, the subjective measures framework and sort of the signal detection theory framework, or SDT framework, make different predictions about what happens in a liberal versus a conservative context if you apply decoding after post-hoc sorting. So to sort of determine which of these is true, we performed two experiments in which we sort of imposed a criterion shift to participants in the same way that that I just explained. So in experiment one, there was a simple detection task, or a simple yes/no task, you might say, and we imposed a. I'll show on the next slide what that looked like. Imposed a criterion shift on those data. And this was performed already a long time ago by a former student of mine when I was doing my own PhD, so very old data by Niels Kloosterman. And we sort of reused those data. So we have already published this data set multiple times, actually, in eLife, looking at the effects of criterion shifts. But here we sort of use those same data again to look at this particular question that I just put forward. So what did the experiment look like? It was basically a simple experiment where there was sort of a continuous stream of textures that would come on the screen, and then at unpredictable moments in that stream, either a figure would appear, so a figure, an orientation defined square would appear, that's what you see here, or just a texture like all the other ones would appear. And the job of the participant was just to detect whenever the figure would appear, and while they did this task, we measured EEG. And then we had two conditions, one liberal condition and one conservative condition, where we basically imposed a penalty on these participants when they would either make a false alarm or when they would make a miss. And when you do that, you get basically the equivalent of the conservative and the liberal condition that I gave the example of in the beginning. So that was the first experiment, and then some people might object. Hey, that's all nice and well, but the problem here is that this detection task doesn't really allow for people to express their subjective experience very well, because it's just a detection. So we did a second experiment, and I'll show the results later, in which we basically used the same experimental setup, except that now the dependent measure wasn't a simple detection where they had to press a button, but they could use what's called the perceptual awareness scale, and that's a awareness scale that some consciousness researchers that are into subjective measures like to use. And in that perceptual awareness scale, you're basically allowed to give a more sort of fine-grained response with respect to your experience. So either you say no, which means I have absolutely no experience, or one means I saw a brief glimpse, or two, I had an almost clear experience, whatever that means, or three, I had a clear experience. And the idea was, or of the perceptual awareness scale, the implicit idea is that it's more impenetrable to these criterion shifts, so that it's a true reflection of what you subjectively experience. So that's why we also added that version of the experiment to see how it would pan out when using such a more sensitive subjective measure. The first thing is the behavior. So that's basically how the people responded. So what you see is that in the sensitivity, if you measure it as the hit rate minus the false alarm rate is more or less the same for the liberal and the conservative condition. But there's a huge effect on the criterion, and that means that you see a lower hit rate and also a lower false alarm rate, as I explained in the example that I gave. So that's the behavior that we saw in experiment 1. And then in experiment 2, you basically see the same thing. Here we had 3 pos levels, and those pos levels, pos 1, 2, 3, all mean seen, except that 1 means barely seen, and 3 means very clearly seen, and pos 0 means absolutely didn't see. But here too, you see very strong criterion shifts, despite the fact that we explicitly instructed the participants, please respond according to your experience and not according to anything that maximizes your rewards or anything. So you see this fact that the POS is not immune to these criterion shifts. But now the real beef question is, what are the effects of post-hoc sorting these trials on this, using these responses on decoding? And to remind you, there's a different prediction for subjective measures versus SDT. So first, the average classification performance of these 2 experiments. The green one is experiment 1, the orange one is experiment 2, and this is the decoding of the figure versus the homogeneous trials, and the black one is the average decoding accuracy of the 2. You see that the 2 have very different decoding accuracies. That immediately illustrates also what I explained in the beginning, that you cannot really compare decoding accuracies between experiments at all, because there can be different trial counts, for example, and in this case, we did have many more sessions in the first experiment than in the second experiment. And there was also a minor difference in terms of the duration of the stimulus on the screen. So that's why you get these different decoding accuracies. But the important thing is here that we selected 3 time points here. So these 3 time points, and then looked at the decoding accuracy in the conservative and in the liberal case after post-hoc sorting. And this is the result of that. So here you see at the top half the decoding accuracies in experiment 1 for unseen and for seen, and in the bottom for the 4 different pass levels, pass 0, pass 1, pass 2, and pass 3. And importantly, what we did here is we completely equated all the trial counts, and the physical stimulation was exactly identical. So the only difference between the decoding performances that you see is that some of these decoding performances were contingent on the criterion that the participants set themselves when they were in the task. And then you see that, as predicted, indeed decoding accuracy is higher in the conservative condition. You also see that in the PAS case. There are some differences between seen and unseen that I won't have time to get into, but I can if there's later questions about that. But if you collapse across all this, and it shouldn't really matter if you collapse across it, then what you see is very strong support for this prediction that you would get from SDT, which is higher decoding accuracy for the conservative versus the liberal. That is a direct result of the fact that when people are conservative, they are more likely to respond or they move their criterion basically to the right, and then you get a direct effect of that in the decoding accuracy when you start sorting trials based on that. We also did the exact same analysis, but then without sorting those trials, so basically taking all trials. That's what you see here, sort of a control analysis, you might say. And there you see that there's no difference between the conditions, the liberal and the conservative conditions at all. So that again shows that the effect that you see of this higher decoding accuracy in conservative is a direct consequence of the fact that that you're sorting, your post-hoc sorting on your trials. So post-hoc sorting is actually a bad idea altogether. Here I give one example of why it's a bad idea. You also get other effects like regression to the mean that have been well established. But here's just a point that you get this effect here, and of course that this is support for the regular standard detection theory framework rather than this sort of esoteric subjective measures framework. And more generally, that decoding can leverage these sort of I would say confounds, where in this case I would say the surprising unconscious working memory is basically just a result of people being in a in a task context where they are conservative. So there are probably a lot of stimuli that are difficult to see, and maybe some very visible ones. And if you're in a context like that, you are likely to say, okay, I only indicate that I see something when it's very clear and not when it's very hard to see. But you can, of course, push around this criterion effect, this criterion in many ways. And if you would put together the experiment in a different way, you would get a different outcome. Yeah, more generally, this doesn't relate to decoding, but it's just generally that we currently have a paper to actually support this fact. I said a little while back in the presentation that there's not a lot of evidence, actually, to empirical evidence to say whether a criterion effect that is induced by reward or something like that, whether that influences your conscious perception. But we shortly have, hopefully in PNES, it's in revision now, a paper out to support that empirically, that indeed those things don't result in shifts in conscious experience. So that almost wraps it up. My general advice are to use a separate training set in complex frameworks, to use filtering very cautiously, and to, most of the time, I would say, or maybe always, refrain from post-hoc sorting in doing experimental work. It's problematic for many reasons. It doesn't allow you to establish causality. It gives regression to the mean. I didn't talk about any of those, but also it basically results in criterion confounds. Thanks for all those that stuck around, because I know it's very hot over where you are, and I ran quite a bit over time. And thanks to all these people that contributed to this experiment.